perhaps controversial claim in the other conversation we were having, that intelligence should be better viewed as a kind of creativity. Now, this is sort of pushing the limits of the science channel, I suppose, but psychology has a pretense at being science, and it is psychology from where we get this notion that there is this thing called intelligence. You can measure it with something called an IQ test, and people have different quantities of it. So I just want to make a few remarks about that. The first is that learning, the capacity to understand something, to do maths, to do science, whatever the academic or intellectual endeavour happens to be, is a process of knowledge creation. What a student does when they're studying, when they're trying to understand something, it turns out is exactly the same kind of thing that the scientist is doing when they're trying to understand something for the first time. In both cases, it's just trying to understand something for the first time. Now, in the case of the scientist, it can often be understanding something for the first time in the history of humanity. And in the case of the student, well, yes, someone else already understood this and wrote it down, but in order for them to have the explanation, to create the understanding in their own mind, that's what they're doing. They're creating the understanding. Now, Popper had this comparison between the mind as a bucket, which is the traditional view, you just pour information into the bucket, and the searchlight or the spotlight, the searchlight going out there, kind of looking for stuff, trying to see what reality is there and error correcting, that kind of thing. But what we're engaged in when we're trying to learn something is that process of creation. We're all scientists in the same way that a scientist is. What we're going through is the same mental activity that a scientist is going through by conjecturing, guessing the nature of reality, and then trying to refute those guesses. And if they go unrefuted, then we say, well, that's a thing that we know. So what's that got to do with anything? Well, as I explained elsewhere, we're all universal explainers. That's what a person is. A person has this capacity to explain anything that's explicable. And again, for reasons beyond the scope of this here and right now, I won't go through the explanation again. It's provably the case that once you've got this capacity for explanation, you're universal in the capacity for that explanation, and everything out there in the entire universe, every single physical thing that happens is computable and explicable by us. There's no physical phenomena that can appear on the horizon that is going to be beyond our capacity to understand. And this fact is extremely poorly appreciated, perhaps especially by academics and intellectuals who are quite prone to saying things like, and I said this earlier, well, it just might be the case that the ultimate truths of science are beyond us to understand. Now, putting aside the fact that we're not going to get there to the ultimate truths of science, what we're going to do is continue to refine our understanding of reality over time, and that will just be a continual process. And that won't come to an end. We'll always just keep improving more and more our explanations. And there can be no explanation out there that is beyond us, because I've done a reductio ad absurdum somewhere on my website about this, that if there were such an explanation, if someone posits the inexplicable, then there must be a reason why it's inexplicable. So we could be given an explanation as to why that thing is inexplicable. There must be a step somewhere in the explanation which we can't get. So why can't we break down that step into its atomic parts, so to speak, and understand individual steps? That was what we do normally. Some explanations are not understandable by some people because they haven't been correctly explained at the right level. There's that great YouTube series out there that goes through explaining stuff to a 5-year-old, then explaining stuff to a high school student, explaining stuff to an undergraduate, a postgraduate, and then a professional expert. They had 5 levels of explanation kind of thing. That kind of thing is always possible. It's always possible for anyone, if they were to sit down for long enough, and importantly, have the interest, could understand whatever that thing happens to be. And so what I just said there gets at the heart of the matter as to why I say intelligence isn't really a helpful idea. IQ isn't really a helpful idea. Unless the I refers to something like interest quotient, because we value certain different kinds of knowledge in society differently to others. And not everyone has an interest in things like mathematics and physics, but we think, well, the people who really understand reality, who are therefore the smartest, other people who are really good at maths and physics and the physical sciences and that kind of thing. But that's a value judgment. And the only reason that other people can't do physics and mathematics is because literally they don't have an interest. And just as well, we don't want everyone to be physicists and mathematicians. Society would grind to a halt if everyone was like David Deutsch or something like that. What we want is humanity to be engaged in every single problem from every single direction, because we don't know where the so-called existential ones are going to come next, the next disease, the next social problem, whatever it happens to be. But we do have this impression, and I think it's just for cultural reasons, that the physicists and the mathematicians and those kind of people are in some sense the smartest. But as I said, because we are all inherently universal explainers, anyone can in principle understand anything else that can be understood by anyone else, and that is literally everything. But of course we don't. We're not all interested in the same kind of thing. So then it raises the question, and I'd certainly be in a debate with people like Jordan Peterson who would insist that, no, IQ's a thing. Indeed, it's predictive of how successful you're going to be in society. And now, I absolutely agree with that. If you give an IQ test to someone and they perform quite well, then on average, that person is going to do better in society than the person who performs poorly. But this is a proxy for being able to just move through society, being able to fit in, to understand the kind of knowledge that helps you to succeed in life. But it doesn't mean that the person who performs poorly on the IQ test is literally incapable of either improving on the IQ test or of just learning the stuff that they need in order to succeed in society. People can improve on IQ tests. IQ tests have certain kinds of questions, which if you practice them, you can improve. Most people aren't interested in trying to improve that particular skill set. They're kind of boring, sort of silly little questions, but this is what psychologists gift us with. I hope there are no psychologists in the audience. I don't mean to completely insult the entire field, but stuff like that is, as we would say, predictive. Predictive without being explanatory. It doesn't get to the heart of what a mind is, and I think psychology as a field should be more engaged in what a mind is all about, how memes, ideas, propagate inside minds and between minds. I think that should be the business of psychology, academic psychology of that kind, rather than trying to rank order people with a number based on their intelligence, this thing that is said to be different between people. But as I've already said, the true test of personhood is creativity. Can you create explanations? And we all have that, and we all have that to the same extent. But then why are some people more or less successful? Why do some people appear more or less intelligent? Well, again, it comes back to interest, and it comes back to their problem situation, and it comes back to a whole bunch of other quirky things about their life, I would say. People know different stuff. They learn different stuff. They create different explanations. And it's true to say that if you choose to create certain kinds of explanations, let's say at the moment, certain kinds of explanations about how to code computers, let's say, how to understand what companies are best to invest in. Yeah, absolutely. That kind of stuff is going to, in general, broadly speaking, lead to a more profitable life than someone who chooses to create explanations about, dance theory, something like that. This is just the fact of the matter, and this is what it means to choose to do what it takes to succeed in society, or choose to follow your interest because you're just passionate about it, regardless of how successful that might end up making you be. And people, nonetheless, still make this value judgment that, well, if you end up succeeding because you're mathematically proficient, then this is a sign of intelligence. But on the other hand, if you don't succeed because you take no interest in mathematics and instead you spend your time doing pottery or doing poetry, then somehow this is not a sign of intelligence. But in fact, they're both just different kinds of creativity. And we shouldn't want everyone to be super uber mathematicians and no one to be poets. But it is a value judgment that society makes. And the individual person, especially a person growing up, Well, they have to choose. You have to choose, and you have to accept reality. Reality says, well, if you choose this one, in general, you're going to be more financially secure than that one, and that's just reality. And you can stamp your feet all you like, and psychologists can say one indicates high IQ and one doesn't. But reality is reality, and if you chose to try and find interest in the thing that is more profitable, then you would, in all likelihood, succeed. And I would just say on that, by the way, that I think it's a common misconception that people just have their interests and you can't change your interests. I think that's wrong. I think that if you're kind of sitting there, especially as a young person, and wishing to yourself, oh, if only I was better at maths, if only I was interested in maths or interested in coding, but I'm not. Well, you can. I think you can. I think everything is inherently interesting. You just need a better guide, a better route into that particular subject. You might have to coerce yourself just a little for a little while, some hours each day, but eventually you'll find the reason why certain things actually are inherently interesting. And once you find that they're inherently interesting, it's just sort of an easy downhill slope from there. You'll just find that it opens up this whole new world. And so this is why I'm saying that, people don't have these differences in IQ. I know personally of people who are quite famous physicists. In fact, this is well known in the field of physics and astrophysics in particular, that many of the most accomplished physicists, well, notable, there are some notable physicists out there, who started out doing stuff, either not going to university at all, and then later on took up physics and became quite successful. So their teachers would have said to them at the time, well, you're hopeless, you've got no chance, you've got a lower IQ. The famous science communicator and physicist Brian Cox apparently got a D in mathematics in high school. So at the time, any teacher or any psychologist would have diagnosed him with an incapacity to do physics, but he became a famous particle physicist and a famous physics communicator. There are so many examples like that. One of my own lecturers started off as a historian who had no interest either in mathematics or physics. And only later, and I'm speaking of a guy called Charlie Lineweaver, he was a soccer player, he was a historian. And then later on in life, I don't know, some point in his 20s, he just decided, I'm kind of interested in this physics stuff. And has become one of the most prolific living physicists and astrophysicists today. Brilliant guy. And this is not an unknown kind of story. So what happened to people like that? Did they start off with a lower IQ and then get a higher IQ? Well, according to the test, they probably did. But I would just say, they were creative, and to the same extent they were creative all the way along, and their interest just changed. And this can be true of anyone, which is an optimistic way of looking at people's life situation, by the way, that if you're not happy with the thing that you're doing, it's not making you money, and you don't think you're earning the social cachet you deserve or something like that, then you can change tack. It's never too late, because we have this universally creative mind that can literally learn anything, and that's provably the case.
So I agree with you in that the root for intelligence is creativity, and Deutsch talks about this a lot, but it might be a leap from there to saying that we're all equally intelligent. You're right in that we're all equally capable of understanding explanations, and a single explanation can override so much else that a person who has the right explanation for how things work is going to be way more effective than someone who has the wrong explanation for how things work. But at the same time, people do diverge, and I would argue that they diverge on two different metrics at the very least. The first metric is, of course, the rate at which they are creative. So how often do you apply your creativity as opposed to just take what is handed to you? And how often do you sort of gather new and stronger models and understandings that then allow you to be creative at the next level? So, for example, in the Eli 5 case, Explain Like I'm 5 case, once you have some good models, you've exercised your creativity and figured out some part of the world, then people can explain it to you like you're 10, and then like 15, and then like you're 20. And so you can compound your knowledge at a faster rate if you have a better framework. And then that allows you to be more and more creative accurately as time goes on, and that allows you to also be more successful in life, which can be a measure of your intelligence. One could also argue that there might be different CPU speeds between humans. In other words, some of you are being creative faster than others and figuring things out faster. That may be a little bit of the creativity component that's picked up under the IQ test or general intelligence, although I know that's not really what IQ tests measure. They don't do a great job measuring creativity. But they might be measuring how creative you were in the past, how many concepts you picked up, and therefore how quickly you can manipulate them in your head. But the most important missing piece that I don't think you talked about is error correction. Creativity alone is not enough because you can creatively make guesses, but those guesses can be wrong. And I find that most people are not that dedicated to error correction. They are willing to take their first or second or third creative leap and leave that as good enough. Whereas I would argue that people who learn better over time are really bought into this idea that they're not always correct, that they're fallible, and that the truth is more important than appearing to be correct. And they don't mind going back and spending the calories and spending the energy to revisit previous thought. So I think creativity alone without error correction doesn't work, just like mutation doesn't work without selection, or an invention trial doesn't work without the error correction part. So so in my mind, it's creativity plus error correction. Different people do both of those at different rates. They absolutely have different interest levels. And then when you combine all of that, the people who have been more creative and more error correcting faster and more interested and more curious, as Ilya also points out in the comments, for longer, those people end up having stronger basis and models for being creative in the future about more and more difficult, more and more complex things. In other words, if you have come up with a strong foundation of knowledge and intellect and models and reasoning, then you're going to be in a better position to tackle the next problem that comes along. As a simple example, some people are interested in astrology and other people are interested in physics. People interested in astrology will apply some creativity around why and how astrology works. They don't necessarily bother to error correct. Astrology is nowhere near as deep of a science or deep of anything as physics is. So they'll stop earlier, they're less curious, they're satisfied with an explanation that's likely false. And so that does not allow them to have a strong foundation for future reasoning. Whereas someone who is interested in error correction will realize that astrology does a poor job of predicting things. It's not valuable. It's got all kinds of problems. There's good explanation. They will then end up navigating towards physics. And then with physics as their foundation and error-corrected and well-understood physics at the foundational levels, they're going to be better set up for solving the future creative problems accurately. All of this is a straw man. I know you believe this. I know you understand this. But I'm just kind of laying out for the audience that it's not just creativity. It's creativity plus error correction. So truth seeking, finding out what is true and being very skeptical about what is claimed to be true is the other leg of this beast. So to summarize, curiosity and interest is what gets you started. Creativity is what makes you human and allows you to explain anything, assuming you're curious enough to pursue the explanation. And then error correction is what allows you to make sure that it's true, so that then you can go be curious, creative, and error correcting about the next thing. And there probably are differences in humans as to how quickly you can do these things. But that said, that doesn't necessarily turn into a difference about how intelligent you are, because if you can quickly go through 10 bad explanations and end up with 10 bad explanations where somebody else plods through and just gets one good explanation, the person who has the one accurate good explanation is, for all functional purposes, going to be more intelligent in this universe. They're going to create more accurate knowledge, they're going to encounter reality better, and they're going to deal with the problems that life throws at them better.
First, let me apologise for any ambient noise. I hope it's not intolerable. I'm outside in the city at a park. I agree with everything you say there. Yes, I think we're on exactly the same page. The optimistic upshot of both what you've said and I think what I've said is that the overwhelming majority of what is called intelligence, it can be learned. And so we've got this native creativity, all human beings have it, but it too can be buffeted, it can be hampered by anti-rational memes. And I suppose anti-rational memes, that could be an entire podcast in and of itself. So the truth of the matter is we can learn to be more creative. We've all got the capacity to be universal explainers, but that doesn't mean any of us are going to be actually as open-minded as we could be. As you say, error correction is necessary as well. But I would say, well, and I think you would agree, that too can be learned, that can be improved. That's our critical thinking capacity. And there are techniques on how to think more carefully, more critically. Not a lot of people necessarily engage in it, and that in part is due to how many anti-rational memes they've accumulated over the course of their life. And that can be quite a lot. And yes, there may very well be speed differences. I think there probably are, and that might very well be a hardware issue. It might be genetic, but we don't know at this point, I don't think. Certainly with any other computer, processing speed is just determined by clock rates, and, indeed memory is a hardware issue as well. But with us, actually, memory is an interesting thing because it seems as if people can indeed train their memories. And, you see these people who develop certain amazing skills, like remembering pi to 1,000 places or more, or they can be shown a random shuffle of cards one time and then recall it instantly. And these people tend to say of their own skills, this can be learned, it's not that hard, it's just that it's kind of a boring skill to develop and not many people do. So perhaps all of this stuff is learnable, it might all be improvable. That doesn't mean that we will, of course. And I suppose what I want to say about that is that as far as I'm aware, and I might not be keeping up with the very latest, but just listening to popularisers of the subject, namely psychology, I don't think this is the prevailing view in that discipline, where it seems to be assumed that there just is some genetic, hardwired kind of intelligence, fixed at birth and unalterable. But I think that's inconsistent with what we know of physics. Modulo clock speed, or how fast a person can think, perhaps that is determined by genetics or physical brain structure in some way. But like you say, that might just mean you can think of 10 terrible ideas faster than someone else. But never mind psychology, neuroscience. Neuroscience over the last few decades is telling us that even the physical brain has this plasticity in ways we never thought possible decades ago. So maybe there are ways we can learn to speed up thinking, just as we can improve our physical memories. Maybe we can grow that part of the region brain region through training in some way. I think understandings in neuroscience are a bit primitive, but as a working assumption, I think it's good to err on that side of the ledger, especially if you have kids, to tell them, to say, your brain is not fixed. It can, in principle, be changed. And as for your mind, well, that's entirely open to being transformed. You can change your mind for the better and learn anything. Well, modulo, like I say, the anti-rational memes which we tend to accumulate. Perhaps I'll just say something quickly about anti-rational memes. So anti-rational memes this is an idea pioneered by David Deutsch. Meme theory is still in its infancy, but anti-rational memes, they're not irrational. Irrational memes are just false ideas, they can be things like astrology. But what anti-rational memes are, these are ideas that actively suppress error correction. They can be explicit or they can be implicit. They include things like the dogmas that people have around, especially like religion. You're not allowed to criticise the holy book. If you even think of criticising the holy book, you're going to be, punished with violence. You're going to be sent to hell or something like that. So that actively stops people from ever engaging in critical thinking about certain topics. It says some ideas are out of reach for you to improve. But they can also, even if you're a secular, rational person, you think of yourself as a rational person, they can also, your mind can be riddled with anti-rational memes, and I think everyone has this. Just things like telling yourself, well, I can't do maths, I'm hopeless at it, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to improve my numeracy. I have this, with languages. I keep on telling myself, I'm just never going to get this Korean thing, I just can't make the sounds. But I know also simultaneously, if only I tried a bit harder, if I wasn't so self-conscious when I was trying to speak to Korean people and making errors, then I would improve. But we all carry around these kind of anti-rational ways of thinking about how, we're not good enough, we're not able to learn this, that, or the other thing. And we can undo that. That too can be improved. Telling yourself you're hopeless and you're not intelligent enough, well, that anti-rational meme is actively undermining your own creativity and capacity to learn faster, saying you'll never get out of this, you're never going to improve. Anti-critical. It prevents you from fixing the thing that you want to fix, from finding the solution to your problem, from being creative. So there are these differences in creativity between people that can manifest itself as appearing to be different in intelligence, because a software issue, you know, we've got software, we've got our minds, and that can include the creative algorithm, and it can include things that undermine the creativity. And in addition, in theory, as far as our understanding of the brain goes, we've got the hardware. You've got the brain, and it has a fixed amount of processing speed and memory. But as I just said, you know, we understand so little about the brain. It could be that the brain has this plasticity where even that's not fixed. We just don't know. And I think we're just, again, using that phrase again, scratching the surface of what we do know when it comes to the psychology of memes and the neuroscience of brains.
Thank you, Brad, for that cogent and detailed explanation. I would just highlight one thing from what you said, which is that even if your clock speed is lower, even if you started out behind, even if you aren't necessarily as quote unquote intelligent, just by making sure that you have the right ideas, which are good explanations, and by being open-minded and being okay with error correction, you're going to go very, very far. In fact, I would say that having a few of the correct explanations and good ideas is way more important than having a head stuffed full of useless facts, many of which might be wrong.